Okay, welcome to The Brood. I'm Letitia, and I'm here with Josh. Hi, Josh.
Hello?
And Chris. Hello, Chris.
Hi there.
So, for our very first podcast, since this is a podcast dedicated to the discussion of the category of horror, whatever that might be, I thought it might be useful for us to start by talking a little bit about what horror is as a genre, what makes it different than sort of similar genres such as thriller or science fiction, which sometimes can cross over into that. And I'm going to turn it over to you guys, Chris and Josh, first, but I wanted to maybe start with a few quotes that I found that I thought were interesting and might, you could, ignore them if they're not helpful, but if they are helpful, bring out some things that we could kind of wrestle with. Um,
Sounds great.
yeah, and so my first thought was to look at the AMC's film site on the history of horror films, and this is how they define horror films. Horror films are an unsettling film designed to frighten and panic, cause dread and alarm, and to evoke our hidden worst fears, often in a terrifying, shocking finale, while captivating and entertaining us at the same time in a cathartic experience. So that's a pretty
Hmm.
basic general.
hmm
Um, so I was also looking at fiction, horror fiction, and the writer Douglas Winter says that horror isn't a genre like the mystery or science fiction or western. It's not a kind of fiction, and we could maybe say not a kind of movie too. Um, it's an emotion, is basically his argument. Okay, and Robin Wood, a critic of the horror film in the 70s, I think he wrote a few books. He or she, I'm actually not sure which it is, but wrote in the introduction to American horror film. And this is in the context of talking about the other, in capital
Yes.
O, the other. It is the horror novel that responds in the most clear cut and direct way, because central to it is the actual dramatization of the dual concept of the repressed, the other, in the figure of the monster. One might say that the true subject of horror is the struggle for recognition of all that our civilization represses and oppresses. So that one's a little bit maybe difficult to parse through, but I thought I'd throw those out there and see what you guys think. What makes something horror? What makes it fall into that genre, and is it even a genre?
Well, I'm glad we got Aristotle on the table right off the bat.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, I kind of, when it came to the a later question that we want to get to in terms of why this matters to us, that I think that kind of comes into play a little more for me. Um, I do kind of agree with that idea that we're not really talking about a genre, that we are talking about an
Mhm.
experience. I do find that to be useful. You know, and it explains a lot about how some of my greatest experiences of horror film are in things that are other than horror films, that
Mm,
are not intentionally so. So I find that useful.
Yeah,
yeah.
I think that and then you mentioned earlier something about science fiction, can sometimes being overlapping with horror. Well, I think that that definition of being an experience, if you look at something maybe like the film Alien, maybe that makes it kind of clear that
Mhm.
that is a horror film
Mhm.
because of the experience you have watching that film is um, very different, I think, than the experience you would have watching a science fiction film. So I think the criteria of the experience, what that experience is, that is a good tool to measure or to kind of figure out what horror is.
At the same time, and I jotted down several of my own kind of definitions of horror,
Oh, good.
and what makes it problematic is that any definition that I've come up with, the definitions that we've just been tracing out already, really kind of excludes 99.9% of the things in the horror aisle in the video
Hmm.
store. The very few are the films that can actually deliver that experience,
hmm
um, and so I don't know if that just means that horror is essentially a failed genre or what. But I mean, and I actually enjoy a lot of horror films that don't deliver that. I
Yeah.
mean, there are multiple reasons why we approach those films, I think. So.
And living in New York, there's a lot of pizza, and some of that pizza certainly delivers, but there is, I guess, a reason why there is just so much available
Mm.
because I don't know, you're always hoping whatever place you walk into is going to have something that you're going to want to return to, but oftentimes it's not the case. But I do think that maybe it is the chasing of that experience, that you're willing, that so many things can be produced because horror is a genre that people seem willing to give something a chance because they enjoy that experience so much, and they're willing to take the risk, and sometimes with results that aren't so great, and sometimes in those great times you find something truly, truly excellent that gives you that experience you've been looking for.
When Josh was talking about, though, of how lots of things in the horror section don't really fit his personal category, I think of a lot of movies that, like, for example, Piranha 3D. I don't think I'm supposed to actually be scared of this movie. I'm not supposed to have dread. I don't really think it's not really evoking fear, but it's still considered a horror movie. And there's tons of horror movies like this that sort of use, I guess, the horror structure, the horror tropes, the kind of thing that that in Scream were parodied very clearly, And it now almost seems like it's so clear what a horror genre of a film is supposed to do that it's now funny. There's not a lot of room for actually being afraid based on those old structures that we
and at
call.
The same time, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
At the same time, we wouldn't say that a film like Piranha 3D is a failure in that way.
No.
I mean, that obviously that was not part of the intent. And I come back to Chris's analogy. I thought you were going to go a completely different place with that pizza analogy.
Please run with it, please.
We'll beat it to death, I think.
Yeah.
Where I was pretty sure you're going with that is that there's pizza places because pizza is good, and even bad pizza is pretty good. Like that there's a sense
that I agree with.
That a bad horror movie is quite often, where it might not be the same visceral experience, is quite often actually more entertaining than the competent horror movie.
Mm.
That there's very little middle ground as far as I can see.
Yeah.
So,
and sophisticated.
I just wanted to get on the pizza bandwagon there.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and sometimes exactly, like, even when it's not great, it's still good. It's still something that's understandable. That's something I feel about horror, is that horror has a very clear, to a degree, language that we seem to understand. And I think there is a kind of, when watching a film, there is an exhilaration to understanding, and I think that horror provides that because certain things, it is larger than life sometimes, and very expressionistic, very stylized, depending on what horror we're talking about. And those things become, I think, more clear to recognize. And I think we enjoy that.
So are you just really discussing kind of the appeal of genre in general? I mean,
I think, yeah.
That's why we latch on to genres, is because we do have that comfort zone. And I have problems with the issue of genre in general, but I don't know, to follow up on what you're saying, there seems like a poorly executed family drama is excruciating, whereas a poorly executed slasher film is exactly what you're looking for.
Hello?
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, I lost you for a second.
That a poorly executed slasher film is really almost synonymous with the words slasher film.
So does that mean that horror is not in the realm of the unexpected? You go because you know what you're going to get. Is that what we're saying about horror? Is it?
Maybe that is why I think maybe when something unexpected does happen in horror, it seems like the effect of that is 10 times more shocking than when that happens in another film. Just to take the most obvious example would be something like Psycho. If we want to call that a horror film.
Yeah.
That what that film does is maybe one of the most shocking things, in well-known cinema, and it falls along the lines of horror. I think so. I think I don't know exactly what I'm getting at, but I think when it does succeed, it's that much more powerful when it's horror. Because we understand the language, because the language is so well defined, that when finally there is something new to be said or said in a different way, it's so strong. The effect is so strong on us.
Well, let's actually get down to that. What are the things that make horror? We're talking about a particular language that we can recognize and understand. What are the elements that need to be there to make it? I mean, just to define what we're saying is the thing that needs to be there that is either surprising or not.
I think that idea of the other, that Robin Wood quote, is very substantial. You know, even if you look back to Dracula, which I do, and that is the experience of Renfield's arrival in the Todd Browning film Arrival at Dracula's castle is the explicit encounter with the other, you know, and that I feel like is a big part for me of the language, what I recognize as horror, for me. Or any, you know, to varying degrees. I mean, like, it seems like even in Piranha, you know, Piranha 3D, maybe that's not so much the other, but this kind of dread that this inhuman thing brings.
I don't usually think this way, but I'm thinking very schematically right now, and starting to categorize. And I hear us, you know, as Letitia tries to get us to zero in a little better here on what exactly that language is. It seems like, again, we're dealing with a genre that's so huge and so varied. And in my thinking about this question, I kind of tell me if this seems useful. I'm thinking about kind of three broad categories of things that I would genuinely consider horror, not, you know, schlock or anything like that, but the things that genuinely approach that experience of horror. And one is that kind of tapping into those primal fears, you know, from nightmare imagery to the fear of the dark, you know, just those films that manage to tap into those experiences. There's supernatural fear, which I was thinking a lot about in terms of, you know, from everything from, you know, Dracula to zombie movies to that weird crossover between religious film and horror, you know, with the whole satanic subgenre. That seems pretty important to what we're talking about. And then a more basic kind of breaking of social convention, you know, which the sociopath is kind of or psychopath is the emblem of, you know, this recognition that anyone at any moment can just kind of tear our world apart. You know, they can just stop following the rules and everything crumbles, you know. And I don't know if that's too big. I don't know if that's too small. But those were three ways that I was thinking about genuine unease kind of creeping in.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. And I like that the last category you said of kind of the psychopath that breaks social convention, because they all these and all the things you've mentioned essentially do that to a degree. They all twist reality, or they all change rules that we're comfortable with, and that's, I think, the psychopath, the one that you were speaking about. That's maybe our most like contemporary version of that. But yeah, I think it all is about. It seems a lot of it is about redefining your reality very quickly in a way that you can't deal with. You know, when the supernatural is revealed to be something real, everything changes. You know. And I think there's a degree of that in all those categories.
So it seems there's usually a social element, that the social norms are being violently broken or ignored in some way that's shocking. But there's also sort of a psychological, which of course they go together. But so
I think they're just you know, something like maybe a film like Hellraiser does something like that, does a little bit of both. You know, where everything is, where what was things are revealed to be true that were disregarded in a certain sense. You know, like, you know, these fears about hell and whatnot. Well, now that is true. you know, and now your world is totally changed, and your I don't know, I think there's a lot going on that's a very explicit dealing with that in that film. But I like those categories. I think that makes a lot of sense.
Or I was thinking of to bounce off of that Hellraiser idea, kind of the more mundane version of it that is perhaps even, I don't know, more effective, is that kind of Rosemary's Baby denouement, you know, where it's just very mundane and almost tedious in the way that it's presented. Yeah. But, you know, if you want to talk about realities being changed and, you know, the social conventions being reinterpreted, it's you know, it's right there as well.
And I think Rosemary's Baby is really is connects directly to what Letitia was saying about it being connected to something social, because Rosemary's Baby seems so emblematic of the 60s, and a lot of films kind of followed in the wake of that did similar things that were essentially saying your normalcy, your what you think is normal every day, all these regular things, there's something very sinister that's lurking underneath that, not that far below the surface. And I think that it has something to do with what Letitia was saying as well.
That makes me think of the Robin Wood quote and the rest of that essay, which I don't know if you guys have read, but the main point is that there's this kind of tension between the thing that wants to get in the way of your nuclear family, your, you know, traditional society, that wants to get into your house and destroy your home, or, you know, get in your body and come out as your baby. You know, there's this sense of this other that we have to, that we're terrified of. But Robin Wood's argument seems to be that that a lot of horror films are kind of inherently conservative. The idea is to destroy the other, because it's terrifying and we don't want to have to change our reality to deal with it. Do you find that? I mean, what do you think is the kind of course it's always different whatever film we're talking about, but is there this underlying desire not to have to deal with the other, to destroy it?
I think that is a definite element, that symbolic destruction of the thing that is threatening to whatever the status quo may be. There is a kind of, you know, symbolic destruction that happens that allows you to go back to your sense of rightness with things, and that the world is essentially right and things are all right and as they should be. And I think that is something, a kind of, I think that some horror films, probably a great deal of them, do that. But I think the interesting thing, I was going to bring in a William Burroughs quote at one point where he kind of talks about, it's kind of poetic, but talks about a young boy who's obsessed with everything horrible and everything disgusting that he's not supposed to enjoy, and things that are violent and things that are gross and things that are unhealthy, and essentially that he's everything a young, smart person should be. And I think that there is a degree of, at one point, horror films very much function in the way that we're talking about. But I think because of horror culture now and kind of being reappropriated by people, I think there is a kind of, I don't know, I think we kind of gleefully revel in a lot of the kind of, we root for the monster sometimes. We're okay with the bad things, you know, the quote unquote bad things. I don't know. I think it's a little bit of both. I think it's changing, but at the same time, probably is essentially still operating very much the same way. But there's a fringe kind of area where people are not experiencing them in that way, in that more conservative way.
Well, and it seems to me the danger here is to imagine that horror then is just a form of allegory in general. You know, that every bump in the night is a representation of, you know, some social ill or something. And I find that incredibly limiting. But I do think that Chris is right, that this does have a lot to do with that, to perhaps go against that Wood quote, that there really is a lot of identification with the creature, with the other, with whatever. That certainly, I mean, you know, as a to look at, your big 80s franchises, I mean, the monsters become the thing, right? I mean, your Jasons and your Freddy Kruegers, they're the draw, that. But we've kind of come full circle here, almost, because I feel as if we're getting back to Aristotle again. That catharsis, that idea of that comfortable place, that 120 minutes where you can identify with the scary other thing, that you can watch it wreak havoc, that you're comfortable. Suburban life can be turned upside down. The world can be reimagined in horrible ways. And then in the end, we can go back to eating our microwave pizza, which is still pretty good. It's still, that is a part of it, that catharsis, that just going through it, and it's painless, and it's in the end meaningless, right? That experience, it's safe.
Yeah. Well, it occurs to me also that horror movies don't always let us restore any order. We get to leave a world completely destroyed often in a horror movie. So the other gets to, if we want to keep using that language, I don't know how useful that is, but it usually often gets to win.
Yeah. I think that, in essence, a lot of times that horror gets to win, but generally maybe in the last 10 seconds, last shot, something pops out. But I think that a really, maybe one of the first things I can think of that where you don't escape from the nightmare, essentially, would be like Romero's Dead series, like the first, I mean, that is a world of horror that just continues. It keeps continuing and continuing. And I think that's, just from what Josh was talking about and you were talking about, I never really thought of it in that sense. And kind of, it's a lot more frightening to me, actually, when I think of it in that way, that there is really no return to normalcy. And maybe that is what makes those films significant, in some way,
So anything else you want to add to this, or do you want to talk more specifically about films that have influenced you? And
I think we're in a good place. I think if we could, and I'm the worst at just kind of like derailing sometimes, but I think you guys are good at like, if we could just wrap this portion up, would be like we're right there. We're very close. I feel like, because this is really good so far.
If I was understanding your question, Letitia, would this be a good point to maybe share something that we think actually fits our categories?
Well, my thought was we could move to discussing what made us interested in the genre.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Yep, I'm good with that.
Yeah. So where did you get this love of genre? Are there any early films you can remember, or even books? We can move into the realm of books or music or whatever first made you interested.
Well, at the risk of sounding like some sort of Aristotle freak, I think I do think that, and this goes right back to the very first things that we were discussing tonight. I do think it is that experience. I think that it's that childhood experience of fear, which is probably the greatest kind of sense memory that I can imagine. That nothing from childhood seems as real or as large as being frightened. And there were early movies. Poltergeist came out when I was a little kid. Pretty mainstream movie that scared the crap out of me. And late night movies on HBO, and yeah, some books. Also, growing up in the 80s means I get to be a child of multiple serial killers in the news and in my neighborhood, and I remember being 10 or 11 years old, the Night Stalkers, in the news every day. The slasher movies are on cable on the weekends, and it's like this generally kind of traumatic experience that somehow gets processed into something I don't know, almost positive. It's like there's just something about that. I don't know, searching for that extreme emotion again. I guess that when you can find a genuine scare that kind of taps back into that in some way. I don't know. It sounds a little twisted when I actually lay it out there, but
no, it makes sense to me. I think fear is exciting.
Yeah.
And I think it's and as a child, it's the most. I think it's an excitement that you can understand, or maybe maybe you can't understand it all, but it's definitely an excitement that you experience, and there is something that's just exhilarating about, when something is amiss, like something's going on and it's worthy of fear. That's interesting. Life is interesting. You know what I mean? Something is happening. Like, yeah, if something's going on in the news, if there's a commercial for a scary movie that was playing on TV when I was a kid, that's something's going on, and something's exciting. I mean, that's how I think got so into horror was, yeah, definitely I grew up in the 80s, and it was Freddy Krueger, and Jason, and they were very visible, these characters, you saw a lot of them, but you didn't necessarily have access to them because I was still maybe a little too young to watch those films. So these ideas of what these movies could possibly be, like they grow in your mind. And I just became so, I don't know, excited to see these things, so excited by the idea of these scary things, that I'm, that are going to scare me. The idea that these things are going to scare me was so, I don't know, exciting to me in some way, and right? Yeah, I think the first horror movie I can remember seeing was, there were some kids that lived across the street, and I went over to their house and they had rented The Dream Warriors, the third Nightmare on Elm Street, and I was maybe probably 7 years old or something like that. I don't know. I remember that very vividly, seeing that film, and I definitely wasn't supposed to, I'm sure, but I remember that, and that really, really stuck with me, intensely. And then there was Freddy posters on the wall. There was, just the idea of it, and I related to it in some way that is still, I still struggle with that. Why do I relate to these things? Why is it so exciting to me? I think it is just, there's a naughtiness to it. There's a kind of forbidden side to it in a good natured way, but I really enjoy that.
Yeah. I really relate to that because I think we're probably about the same age, because I was very young when all of the slasher movies came out, and I was never allowed to watch horror movies. That was something that was not allowed in our house. But my mother was obsessed with real crime. So we would watch America's Most Wanted and all of these terrifying, TV movies about real murders, and I would get instructed about what I should do if someone's trying to steal me at the grocery store and how I need to scream. And so I remember having this real sense of there's something really to be afraid of. But but once I remember very vividly, the first, I think, horror thing I ever actually saw was that kind of awful miniseries of It, the Stephen King book, with the Pennywise the clown. And I was watching TV right before bed, and this came on. It was the opening scenes with the little boy, and he's running along in the rain, and it's the clown in the drain, And I saw this, and I turned it off, and I was like, what was that? That is something that I want more of, but it gave me horrible nightmares, and I was crying, and my mother was like, why did you watch this? I told you not to. But it was that sense of I'm scared, and this is exciting. Yeah. So I very much relate to that, yeah.
That might be the most potentially damaging thing you could have seen. I was terrified by that. And I think that, but I really think I relate quite a bit to that America's Most Wanted and stranger danger kind of mentality. They were really instilling in kids at that time, I feel like, a real fear of stranger, and still, is valid somewhat, now, or it's going on. Fear of strangers,
having a plan, and to be on guard because something is amiss, and I think that probably fed a lot into my feelings of like excitement about scary things.
And not to start psychoanalyzing, which sounds like a terrible thing to do, but but I mean that I would agree. We all sound like we're pretty much at the same, roughly the same generation here, and we could extrapolate beyond that. The obsession with kidnapping and things like that on into I remember growing up as a kid being terrified of nuclear war, and just kind of an all-pervasive kind of culture of fear everywhere, which obviously hasn't really gone away.
No.
But that there is a sense that when you are inundated with fear from every angle, that the horror genre might serve a useful purpose, a way of kind of controlling that, packaging it, and as I said before, in your little 2-hour package that makes it obviously, your other is now embodied and killed, and yet will come back next time. But that there is that, I don't know, some sense of closure or something tangible.
Yeah, you can get it in a more kind of intense, pure, it's a concentrated form, but there is there's a resolution, at some that you don't get in life. But maybe that is the great thing about horror, is that there's always another horror film, whether it be whether it's another one in the series, or because I think I've gone through that where I watch every film in a series and I'm sad when I'm done. But I always know there's I can move to something else and keep experiencing that kind of concentrated experience of otherness, or all these things have catharsis and keep going. And I mean, essentially what popular films do, but with horror it's more concentrated. It's more intense. There's more at stake most of the time. I think that has something to do with it. It's more addictive, I think, because it is more intense to a degree.
A lot of the language we've used is the language of addiction, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
Either drugs or pornography is what we But
no, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think that is a lot, for better or worse, it's something I think about a lot, about my view, the way that I view horror films. And it is, I couldn't in good conscience tell you I can cold turkey never watch a horror film again. I can't do it. So I think there is that element there. I mean, with all media you have that, but for some reason with horror, there's a kind of, I don't know, there's something else, something stronger there for me. I don't know why.
Might this be an interesting time to maybe talk about, we've talked about what inspired us to be interested in the genre, but what are some movies or even some scenes from movies that might not be called horror that are kind of your pinnacle of that feeling, that kind of jolt you get, that thing you're looking for in horror that they provide? Like, what are the movies or scenes that get you that fix to continue the language of addiction?
I don't know, Josh.
Well, I can think of a couple. I keep returning to, when we think outside of the genre, I think of that kind of the sociopath, the someone who refuses to play by rules. I think of our villain in No Country for Old Men, mm-hmm. who can with a flip of a coin decide whether he's going to take a life or not, and in a pretty chilling way. That it could be anything Joe Pesci has ever done for Scorsese.
Yeah.
But that same kind of thing, like that really is kind of horror for me. That recognition that there really are people wandering the streets who have no compunction about harming others, and that don't play by the rules that most of us live by, and that at any moment things could be turned upside down. I think that scenes like that are genuinely horrifying.
Absolutely, in a very real world sense, and in a very logical way as well. I think those things definitely, now that I'm adult, are extremely unsettling to me. I think some things creep into a different part of me, especially when I was younger, of kind of maybe more stylistic things, but definitely as of right now, what you're talking about that's what is really disturbing to me. So something actually, the film Magic with Anthony Hopkins is really that was a movie that really unsettled me, that I saw a few years ago, and I think a lot of it had to do with his performance, but also to see that switch in a person, and to see to look at such a delicate psychology, and that was just, I think that kind of, I don't know, dealing with psychology in that way is unsettling to me. I don't know exactly what I'm getting at, but any seemingly kind of seeing someone change like that. The Joe Pesci thing is a good example of that.
The sort of most, I think that I'm agreeing with you guys in that, to me, it's mostly seeing a person suddenly kind of go blank in a way that implies that there's any possibility of what they could do. That's very scary. But the scariest, the most physically frightening, and I wouldn't say it's the jolt that I like, though. It was in a movie called, I think in English the translation of the title is The Fat Girl. Have you heard? It's called A Ma Sœur, which is like To My Sister. Has anyone seen this? Yes.
Catherine Breillat. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. And the ending of that movie.
Shocking.
It was shocking, but there was such dread building up. There's this kind of car scene, to not give it away. There's these a mother and two sisters driving from some resort in France back home, and there's just this sense of something awful is going to happen. Something awful is going to happen, and the most awful thing that could possibly happen does happen. And it's in such a shocking. It suddenly becomes what looks like a horror movie. But it's somehow much more heightened. It's more realistic than I would have wanted, and that is a film that gave me nightmares as an adult. But as a kid, I would say Pennywise the Clown was a very
I think that you're right. Something like that, like Fat Girl, is something. And I think the genius of that film is that there is a sense of dread, but it actually does happen.
Yeah.
And that's maybe one of the boldest strokes I've seen, in a film. And I really love that film. And I think that's incredible. And definitely to see that sense of dread in a film that you wouldn't explicitly call a horror movie, shows that the things that we love about horror are transferable, to their techniques that can be used, or their states of mind that we bring to other films that we watch. That assumption that something has to happen, something's going to happen, something is amiss. But yeah, I agree with you.
Yeah, once again, the more we talk about it, the more I'm convinced that horror mostly lives outside the genre. That the experiences that we're discussing, I'm much more likely to find in that conversation between De Niro and Sybil Shepherd in Taxi Driver or something. That's built into every moment of that scene in a way that is very, very hard to find in anything billing itself as a horror movie. But part of that, I think, is I noticed as we were talking about, I think that as we age, what scares us changes.
Yes.
The little clown toy under the bed was all it took for me, as a kid. Obviously, Letitia still's dealing with that. But now as I grow older, the things that terrify me the most are things happening to children.
Yeah.
And the most bourgeois kinds of fears. The French film Ils, or Them.
Yes.
Which, kind of the home invasion kind of stuff, which is probably the most viscerally frightened I've felt as a recent in a recent film. You know, just like just something as simple as coming down and the front door standing open. You know, that how quickly that can stab at you as an adult. You know, that and how many bases we've just covered in kind of our definition of what horror is. You know, social convention to primal fear to everything. You know, that it just gets at you.
And I think what you're talking about too would be a good subject for something later too, which we could talk about in another podcast. But that some things are scary and scare us because of their scenario and the idea of this thing happening and how scary that is. And some things stylistically, I think, are just scary. And I think in certain ways that's harder to pinpoint sometimes for me, like maybe even something, you know, even moments in Poltergeist, like when you brought up before, and other Tobe Hooper films too, like things that stylistically are just unsettling to me. And that's something I at some point would like to discuss. It's definitely a rabbit hole though, you know. But I agree that my fears have definitely changed since I've gotten a little older. My younger sister asked me once, you know, we were talking about horror films, and she was like, she asked me, well, what scares you? What's really scary to you? And I think she wanted me to say Dracula or Frankenstein or something, but I said, you know, dying alone. You know what I mean? That's like that's like an adult fear. You know what I mean? Like, I'm like, you don't have to really think about that, or you won't maybe ever feel that way. But, you know, that kind of thing, maybe like, you know, losing your job, stuff. I mean, things like that, you know, not scary in the same sense, but I think we have less of those kind of, I don't know, less of those romantic fears, which is, you know, is sad to me in a way, but I don't think you have as many. Maybe that's why we watch horror films still, is to, you know, experience those kind of really romanticized fear. It doesn't matter, you know, how much your tax return is when Freddy, you know, is coming down the hall.
Okay, so I think maybe at this point, this seems like a good place to talk about what we want to do with this podcast. I think that maybe our discussion has made it kind of clear how we'll be doing the podcast. But if you guys have anything else to add, you know, maybe just to start, my thought was to have a sort of critical eye on horror, not academically critical, but that's really thinking about what makes this work, what's interesting about it, what's unique about it, what is this particular, let's say, category of horror doing, and why does it work and why doesn't it work? And to me, this is what I'm interested in for the podcast. But what are you guys thinking?
I definitely agree, and that's something I'd like to do, and definitely to be rigorously kind of keep myself critical, because especially when we brought up any of that kind of language of addiction, you know, I mean, I think it's really important to, you know, you need some distance too, and that's really important to me. And yeah, and I love horror films, but I love talking and thinking about films as well, you know, in a critical way, and it stimulates me in a way that I don't get, you know, just from pure just, you know, kind of like blankly watching things. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. You know, that's what I'm here for, is to be a little more critical, and to maybe bring, and not painfully academic, but, you know, to be able to bring in, you know, other disciplines and bring in other ideas, and to make it, you know, to make it very clear that adults enjoy horror films, you know, in a number of ways, and they're, you know, it's worth being talked about.
Yeah.
I would agree with all that, and throw in one much more selfish kind of goal, and that would be to have, you know, the three of us kind of bringing together, you know, based around a theme or a concept or whatever for an episode, to be surprised, you know, to see connections that I wouldn't ordinarily see, and, you know, see some films that I wouldn't normally see. So
yeah, absolutely.
I'm just hoping to, you know, broaden everything a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I'm already seeing connections that I, you know, I don't make as, and now that I'm seeing them, you know, it's like I feel like there's films I I either haven't seen or haven't seen in a long time that I want to go back and explore, especially the more I find out how they've kind of, how you Josh and Letitia, how you see them, and go back and try to see them with those eyes, in a way.
Yeah, I too am really. I'm looking forward to seeing movies I otherwise would not have seen because I'm pretty sure you guys will bring in things that, me with I'm a little more interested in the very stylized. Suspiria is probably my favorite horror movie, but that's not. It doesn't really have any of the elements we talked about as being horror. It doesn't scare me. I just think it's very beautiful, and I like blood. so my viewing skews toward the beautiful violence, and not so much the gritty realistic, not so much the serial kill. So I want to be able to see more movies than I would have, and understand what it is about them that's interesting. So that's exciting for me.
Yeah, and I think that to be able to also just understand, what makes these films different, because I am guilty sometimes of I love pretty much all horror, without, no reservations, and I think that I would like to be a little more discerning in a certain way and say, well, this is more, because it was really difficult for me, like when you posed, what is a definition of horror, and what are some kind of, as a genre, what can we, say maybe are some, characteristics, and how does it break down maybe, and Josh broke that down really well. I think it's difficult for me. Sometimes I feel a little too close to it, and this is like my favorite, this has been really, really good for me to kind of take a step back and be like, okay, you love the idea of this. How do you feel about the reality of some of this?
Well, before we end this very first podcast, maybe we can talk a little bit about what we have upcoming. I think we've thrown around some ideas about what kind of shows we want to have, and I think our very first official, podcast, one of our themed podcasts, will be on body horror, right?
Uh-huh.
So that sounds exciting. And what else were we talking about? Do you guys want to just throw out a few just to give people some idea of what's to come?
Did we talk about what was it, psychotherapy as a road to horror, or as an element to horror, or films that revolve around that relationship and trauma and things of that nature, which I'm really excited for. And I think maybe we could talk about something, maybe a kind of something that, like you said, like Suspiria, that focuses more on the style, or these kind of somewhat ephemeral things like that stylistically that are unsettling to us in a certain way, certain tricks that are used, maybe. I mean, that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
I'm also kind of interested in, I've been thinking about it a lot today, in the burgeoning horror comedy genre.
Yeah, right?
That I would really kind of like to investigate that. It's interesting and troubling in all kinds of ways that it'd be worth digging into. So
definitely something I need to have more of, to know where I stand, because by all intents and purposes, this should be something I just love absolutely, but it's a problematic thing for me as well. So I'd love to talk about that.
Yeah, those sound really good. I'm really interested in talking about class and horror.
Yes.
I think that's an interesting subject, and I kind of grew up extremely poor in the almost South, and so there's some movies that I see and I think, that looks like my house, but that's where serial killers live.
Yeah, a little bit.
So I'm always curious about that, and
absolutely,
how that's working. So this is exciting.
Mm-hmm. That's a genre that's come back strong. Wow, the murderous people that live in the woods. That is.
And another genre that is this sort of the paranormal activity kind of what would we call this? The kind of handy cam.
Faux documentary.
Yes,
yeah.
Faux documentary horror movie, which I had thought kind of died a little bit after.
Yeah, Blair Witch.
Yeah, after Blair Witch was great, but it just didn't seem to go anywhere. But then there's kind of been a burgeoning of these faux documentaries. So that's, if it's at all interesting, I'd be curious.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And maybe the kind of I think the history of that is very interesting, and how it just keeps coming back. I think that is and that's an interesting, horror is a kind of metaphor for itself, because it, when every time you think something's dead, it comes back. You know what I mean? Yeah. Every time you think you've seen the last of a certain kind of film, it's like enough people forgot that something like that was made, and it's like brand new all over again. So and series are the same way. So, but you know what? I guess it's like Santa. Every year you're kind of looking forward to him stopping by. I don't know. Never mind.
No, that's great. So, like Santa, look forward to hearing us again when we talk about.
You want to talk about scary?
We'll plan our holiday themed horror show.
Oh yeah.
Oh, that's my favorite. One of my favorites. Yeah.
What is the one about the sorority girls and Christmas?
Black Christmas.
Black Christmas. Oh,
Oh.
that's a good
Just
one.
watched it.
Oh, it's so good.
That may be that's one of the films that scared me more than most. Not that, as a sorority girl, I felt, I feared for my life.
All right. Well, thank you guys so much for the wonderful talk, and I think we really nailed down this whole horror thing. I think it's pretty much just we got it. Yeah.
Yeah. I don't think we need another podcast after that.
Yeah. So glad we cleared that up.
Yeah. Good.
And yeah, thank you guys, and have a good night.
All right. You too.